question 1. Can we infer from 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4, that the church assembled every first day of the week?
That's a good question. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Because the language of the text doesn't talk about an assembly. It talks about on every first day of the week, save some, every individual saves some money. Some scholars believe that that text is really talking about individuals putting aside their money at their house, not in the assembly. Right? So I don't think we can necessarily say that this is talking about an assembly. Now, why then would he say every first day of the week? I think that's a good question. So I am of the opinion that probably he's talking about an assembly. But I don't think we can be sure he's talking about an assembly. But given the probability, given the historical probability, that Christians did meet on the first day of the week in the 2nd century. We know that was what they did in the 2nd century. We have a lot of evidence of that. And we do have Acts 20, verse 7, that here's a group of Christians that met on the first day of the week. So I think it's high probability that this was an assembly, but I don't think we can prove that necessarily.
Second question. Most of our discussion, at least some of your illustrations, have centered around the pattern and worship, the assembly. Do you also search for the pattern for organization of the church?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, how big is the pattern? That's a question. How big is the pattern? What does it cover? Does it cover the assembly? Does it cover what you do with your money? Does it cover governance and how you govern and what the nature of that governance is and how, like located preachers? That's not in Scripture, not in the way we do it. You won't find in Scripture located preachers in the way that we practice it. Is that, if it's not in the pattern, do we then exclude located preachers? And we divided over this. There were churches of Christ that divided over this, called the mutual edification wing of churches of Christ. David Lipscomb was a mutual edification person. He didn't believe in these located preachers. He thought that that was outside the pattern. Right? So then it gets to be, okay, how big is the pattern? What does it include? What is expedient? What's inexpedient? Is it expedient to have a located preacher, even though it's not explicitly in the pattern? Is it included in the pattern by expediency? Then questions about governance in terms of, what is the role of an elder? What is, are elders and bishops the same thing? I think they are, but, they're not always called the same thing. Elders are not in the list of Ephesians 4. God gave the church apostles and prophets and evangelists and teachers and pastors and teachers. Now we think pastors may be elders, but doesn't call them elders. And the relationship between Timothy and the elders and Titus and the elders. Looks like the evangelist is appointing elders in Titus. We don't do that. So I think I don't think I think if we tried to create a pattern, put that jigsaw puzzle together to say, okay, this is the right organization and this is the right way of being organized and this is the right way of functioning, I'm not so sure the text can sustain that. On the other hand, in the story, leaders do emerge. And they emerge as elders, and they emerge as evangelists. And we see them in the story operating in different ways and different functions. What can we learn from that? I would want to learn from that and not try to create an organizational chart, but try to learn from the pattern. A story. Yeah. Story as pattern.
So I am going to interject moderator privilege.
Okay. And I could probably
You
go
have
into-
mentioned, because it's a pet peeve of mine,
Okay.
you've mentioned Lamar, you've mentioned Lipscomb, you've referenced Campbell.
Yeah.
And I'm asking you this question because I know how you're going to answer it.
Oh.
So, is it important for us to understand our history?
No.
He just did that.
Yeah, of course it's important to understand that.
Thank
history.
you.
Yeah, yeah. And just like it's important for you to understand your family of origins, right? Who's your mom and dad? Who's your grandfather? That had impact on you that you're probably not even aware of until later in life, right? In some ways. I mean, the more I grow older, the more I recognize, wow, that's my dad in me. You know, that's coming out, you know. Even when you start raising children, you know, oh, my dad used to tell me that. you know, that sort of thing. So understanding our family of origins is a process of understanding ourselves in the present. Why is Acts 2:38 so important to us? You know, where did that come from? How is it that you can spot a person from our heritage just by the few verses they might cite, or the few verses they know, or the songs they sing, or because that history forms us. It shapes us in particular ways. It gives us and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but a rut that we live in. We get into a rut. Ruts are not always bad, all right? Some ruts are good. When you're on the Oregon Trail, you wanted those ruts because that gave you a path, right? But that's what history does for us. It creates ruts. It wires our brain in certain ways. It makes certain things important to us that are not important to anybody else, that we understand, but the outsiders won't understand. Right? And you probably have family traditions that you do or you understand that you have to explain to guests when they come into your house. Churches of Christ are the same way. We've got practices that we have to explain to people when they come into our world. And so knowing our history helps us understand where they came from, why we are that way, why we think that's important. And we can evaluate it then. See, I think, one, we can appreciate the history. It gives us a way of critiquing the history, to recognizing where it went off track. And we learn from that history as well. Because the people in our history, they thought about these things before we did. They studied those verses before we did. And they weren't ignorant, they weren't stupid, and God was with them, and the Spirit dwelt in them. And so we need to listen to them, not just listen to ourselves in our little group, within the last 5 years or something, but be aware of others.
Thank you. Okay, these next two questions are somewhat related and are actually related to a conversation we had on our way over to Alameda this morning. I asked John Mark his thoughts on the future of Churches of Christ. We're in decline, and a lot of thought being put in to that concern. So here are the two questions. How do you think the issues of searching for a pattern have caused so many of our younger generations to leave the Church of Christ? And is the pattern problem related to fewer young men training to be preachers?
Wow, okay. I think I would say that the problem for both of those is not so much the pattern or searching for the pattern, though I think it's a component. I think the more root problem is rigidity, and a lack of flexibility, a lack of grace. rigidity, a lack of grace, and a lack of flexibility, which can arise in the context of searching for a pattern, right? If you think you got the pattern, you get rigid about it, and everybody else is excluded. Yeah, that the pattern can be part of the problem there. But it's more the rigidity of thinking we have arrived, that we have fought for this truth and we know the truth now, and there's nothing, and I'm exaggerating, of course. I'm exaggerating, that there's nothing more to learn. None of us would really say that, right? We wouldn't say that in a conversation over supper. But the impression we leave with a lot of young people, people that I teach at Lipscomb University, for example, the impression that we leave is that we're too rigid and too set in our ways to be open to hearing their voice. And unfortunately, some have had the experience of not being heard. And they carry that experience with them. So I think that that's more fundamental problem, which does go to how we read the Bible. I'm going to talk about this in the sermon tomorrow morning, how Jesus read the Bible. And I'm going to speak to this sort of point here and call us to a way of reading the Bible that is more gracious than rigid. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. But churches of Christ are in decline, and there is a sense, there's no loyalty to churches of Christ, right? There's no sense, I grew up in churches of Christ, therefore I'm going to stay in churches of Christ. That kind of loyalty is gone across the board. I mean, that's not true for Baptists or anybody. Much more independent, much more open to choosing, to seeking what is comfortable or appropriate or what they think is biblical for them. But I do believe this about churches of Christ. I have a hopefulness. My hopefulness is not grounded in, okay, we're going to double our size in the next 10 years. That's not my hope. Hope is not about size. Hope is about the kind of commitment and the sort of space where we have the freedom to minister in or participate in the ministry of Jesus. See, I think churches of Christ can function very well in the culture that is arriving. That we can be independent spaces of hope and faithfulness to the ministry of Jesus, when all around maybe not. But we can be those spaces. We won't be big spaces, but we don't have to be big spaces. We can be spaces where we bear witness to who God is, what God is doing, and we participate in what God is doing. And we do it with mercy and grace, and we do it with a witness that embodies who Jesus is. That I'm hopeful about, because I see that a lot. I see that in younger people. I see that in older people. I see that in a lot of churches. They may be smaller, but in some senses, they're more committed. They may be discouraged. I think that's a big problem, is that as we shrink, we get discouraged. That's why we ought to preach through Hebrews, because that's a shrinking, discouraged church. What do you say to a shrinking, discouraged church? You say, look to Jesus. Consider Jesus. Put your eyes on Jesus. That can be a place of hope. You can encourage one another every day. You can draw near to God and stir each other to good works, and you can profess your hope and assemble together and encourage one another to do good works. That's the hope, I think. And that's the hope I see. I see that hope in places. I just pray for more places like that. So I have a hopeful sense. But it can be a very discouraging time right now. culturally, nationally, churches of Christ, Christianity. It can be discouraging. But remember that in the United States, it may seem discouraging. But the faith of Jesus Christ is exploding around the world. In China, in Africa, in Asia. It's amazing the way Christianity is exploding across the world. We're a little discouraged here in the United States and in Western Europe. But we're not the whole shooting match. We're just one part of it.
So kind of a follow-up to that, could you give us a couple of illustrations where you're seeing some of that happen, or suggest some ways that we could do that?
Suggesting ways to implement, that's a tough one. I'm not an expert in any of that. I struggle like you with that.
We are joining the SEC, so we're going to be in the SEC.
You're going to be what? I didn't understand what you...
In the SEC.
Oh, in the SEC.
Yeah.
Oh, you're switching topics altogether. Okay. And that's why I missed that. Okay. You got the OU. He wore an OU shirt yesterday. Is this normal? He's wearing an OU shirt. Normal. This is the place of God, brother. This is not. Okay, well, here's an example. A moderately conservative church. They're not doing anything that anybody would call progressive. Right. Before COVID, they were like 200, went down during COVID. They're like 300 now. They're in a little community outside of Dixon, Tennessee. And there's something about that community. They're not fighting with one another. They're externally focused, serving the community, gaining a reputation in the community as a place that cares about people, loves people. In a smaller town, you can do that better than in, say, Norman, right? Because Norman has a lot of options about all that, right? But in that small town, they are a place of hope because they're recognized in the community that they love people. And they're not a church that is involved in some kind of fight with each other. They're comfortable with each other, you might say, and they're reaching out to other people, and they're very involved in international missions as well as domestic and about benevolence in their community. I think of a house church that is transforming its neighborhood and attracting their neighbors to this community of faith. I think about a larger church that is kind of more on the progressive side, does things that people would perceive as progressive. I guess what characterizes all of those is an outward focus. That we have to shift our mind from struggling to survive to participating in the outreach of Jesus. And how do we do that? How do we shift our focus? Well, we look to Jesus, okay? And that's simple to say. It's harder to do, right? But it's simple to say. But we refocus. We focus not so much on the internal, but on Jesus, and how then we can bring the life of the church into contact with and an influence with and participation in the ministry of Jesus to those outside. So I think what I see in common for those is a reorientation. Because it's so easy to get in survival mode. And when you get in survival mode, you turn all your energy inward to survive. which is counterproductive to survival. Because there's nothing growing. You're dying. You're not growing, you're dying. I think we have to grow inwardly first. We have to grow, we have to be formed into the image of Christ. We have to be called into the story of Jesus. We want to be like Jesus. We need to maybe adjust our perspective internally so that we can turn it outwardly and be engaged in the ministry of Jesus. That's some just very general thoughts.
Okay. I was hoping we'd run out of time before this next one.
Oh, okay. Well, I'd like to see that.
How do we reconcile cultural dynamics like in 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 12?
1 Timothy 2, 9. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. I have a lot I can say about that.
Everybody is quickly turning to 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 12.
Yeah, 1 Timothy 2, beginning in verse 8, actually, therefore, I want all men lifting up holy hands to pray without anger and disputing. And I want the women, I think, to pray, dress modestly, as is becoming to worshipers of God, not dressed with gold or jewel, pearls and braided hair, but to be devoted to good works. And women should learn. They should be in silence and learn. They should be in quietness and learn. And I do not want a woman to teach a man or have authority over him. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Eve was deceived, and Adam was not deceived, Eve was deceived. And she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, modesty, some other word. That's the text. Okay? So, I have my opinion about this, and I'm not trying to introduce you to that opinion or convince you of that opinion or persuade you. I'm certainly not interested in anything like that. But I do think we need to recognize, as the question said something about culture, right?
Mm-hmm. Cultural dynamics.
Cultural values?
Dynamics.
Cultural dynamics, okay. That there are cultural dynamics going on in that text. I mean, this is the same book that says you should only support widows above 60. Right? This is the same book in the same text that says women should not wear gold, pearls, or braided hair. How many violations do we have of that here? Yeah. This is a text that says women are saved through childbearing. We don't even know what that means. Right? I mean, you got to have a baby to be saved? No, I don't think it means that. So scholars, and I think just anybody, reads that and says, "Oh, what is he talking about?" And I don't see many of you guys lifting hands when you're praying. So there are cultural dynamics to this. Even in setting, "Let the women learn," is a cultural statement in a lot of ways, because learning for women was not always an option in the ancient world. It was for wealthy women; they could be educated. But most women, no, education was not part of their world. So I think we have to recognize the cultural dynamics, the cultural matrix in which this instruction is given, and take note of that and take it into consideration. And on the other hand, there is a theological consideration here, as it appeals to the story, right? It appeals to the narrative. Adam was first created, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, Eve was deceived. And the question is, well, why does he talk about that story? What is it in that story that is important for what he's trying to communicate to this church. And what is the problem in the church that he's addressing? What's going on? Apparently, there are some women who are dressing up, putting on ostentatious. Maybe they're dressing up like Artemis priests. We don't know. We just, we don't know why this gold and pearl and these signs of wealth were a problem, but they were a problem. And we don't know what the men were arguing about, but they were arguing about something. And if we read it in the whole context of the book begins and ends with the problem of false teachers. There are false teachers in this community. Now, if I begin my letter to you talking about X, and I end my letter talking about X is on my mind all the way through, right? Because I'm introducing it to you, and then I'm summarizing it to you. So I think maybe part of the problem here is that there were some false teachers who were influencing the church, and particularly influencing this group of women. Not all the women, but this group of women who were wearing the gold, and for whatever reason they were wearing it. And that those women were deceived. And that's why he talks about Eve. Eve was deceived. Twice he uses the word deceived, as if, that's an emphatic point. Adam was not deceived, Eve was. And that's who I'm talking about these deceived women. I don't want them teaching. So my opinion, which may not be worth much, but my opinion is that Paul is adjusting to a situation. He says, we got these women who are dressing boldly, and they are teaching boldly. That's what that word authority is about, because that word authority is the only time it's ever used in the New Testament. We translated authority in English, and so we think maybe, that's like all these other words, authority. No, the Greek word is the only time it's used in the New Testament. And when it's used before the New Testament, it's always used in a negative way, like domineer, or the boss, or an autocrat. So I think what Paul is saying is, I do not want these women who are dressing up and making such a show for whatever reason. They need to learn. And I don't want them, because they're deceived. They don't understand the story very well. They don't know what we're really doing here. They need to learn, and I don't want them teaching and domineering the community. Let them learn. Once they learn, they can teach. But right now, they're deceived. But they can be saved. They're not lost. They're not hopeless. They can be saved. They can learn, and they can be saved if they continue in faith. They can be saved because of Jesus Christ. That's how I understand the childbearing. She will be saved through childbearing. Adam was created, then Eve. Eve was deceived, Adam wasn't. But Eve, will be saved through the childbearing, which I take as a reference to the messianic childbearing, which I'm not at all sure about that. I don't know for sure. I would not die on that hill. I would say, it could be something else. I don't know. I'm not sure. So that's my opinion. But there are cultural dynamics involved. Just when we talk about having pearls and braided hair and gold, those are cultural symbols, right? They have a cultural message. Braided hair in Africa has a different message. It's not about ostentatious. It's not about wealth. It's about some identity. Gold has a different message when we wear it on our ring, right? On our finger. So those are cultural images. So culture has something to do with this. But theology has something to do with it too. And that's why we don't want men arguing in their prayers, and we don't want women dressing. We don't want men dressing like that either, right? I mean, we've all heard sermons on modesty, right? From 1 Timothy 2:9. Be modest. You got to dress modestly. Women, you should dress modestly. Men, it doesn't matter. You go ahead. No, that's not what he's saying, right? He's not saying women dress modestly, men can dress however they want. No, it's just that the women were the problem. Men, when you're praying, don't argue. Does that mean women couldn't pray? No, it's just that men were the arguing. They were doing the arguing. Women were doing the dressing up. So those were cultural kinds of dynamics in the text. We have to pay attention to that.
We are out of time, but one quick follow-up. One quick follow-up to that. So a concern about making everything in Scripture cultural.
Yeah. No, everything in Scripture is not cultural. Everything in Scripture is written within a culture. It's written in Greek. That's a culture, right? It's written in a particular geographical space. It's written with particular styles of clothing. So everything within Scripture is written exists within a culture. Culture is inescapable. But that doesn't make everything relative to culture. The story of God initiating salvation, God becoming human. And when God became human, he became a Jew living in Palestine, wearing the clothes of Palestinian Jews, wearing tassels on his clothing. He looked quite cultural, right? But he was God in the flesh, and he imaged God in the flesh. And so he was also quite theological. So theology is the story, and the story is what shapes us, and the story is what transcends culture and moves through culture. It's that story we want to embody in our culture. Paul was writing how to take the mystery of Christ and live out the mystery of Christ in Greco-Roman world. We want to know the mystery of Christ. And when we know the mystery of Christ and it becomes part of us, and we are formed by the mystery of Christ, then we want to live that out in our world. And we have to be careful that we don't take Paul's world and make it our world. Because there's a difference between the Greco-Roman world and our world. Right? We want to live out the story. We want to live it faithfully. And we live it faithfully in our culture. Because we can't escape culture. We're all culture. Just by what we wear, by how we dress, by the language we use, by the food we eat. Everything's culture. But that doesn't make everything relative. Our sexual ethic is not relative. It's rooted in the story. Right? So we can talk about a lot of things like that. But yeah, not everything is relative to culture, but everything is embedded in culture.
If we didn't get to your question, I would encourage you to ask John Mark privately. I'm sure you'll take a couple of minutes.
Yeah, sure.
I just volunteered your time, but it's okay. Can we express our appreciation to John Mark for being with us today?